Dr. Henry has managed to merge an economics background, an environmental background, disciplines, passions. Could I ask you, Ken, in terms of your career and sort of a bit of background about you, that's obviously enabled you to be a great advocate. It's probably had its challenges too, but bringing those two things together, the environmental passion, discipline, the economics.
Yeah, sure. So, well, I was saying at the table that I was born onto a dairy farm really in the Manning Valley, I suppose. Anyway, the Manning was the closest major river to where this dairy farm was. Unfortunately, the dairy farm was too far from the river, and it didn't get the rainfall that any respectable dairy farmer would want. And so, good news for me, not so good news for my parents, is that the dairy farm went broke when I was very, very young. And my mother, having 4 children, no, she had 3. She was pregnant with the 4th. Well, she didn't know that many years later she was going to have a 5th, but there you go. She decided that, well, if the farm is broke, the best thing I can do is get an education for my kids. And so the family moved into town. By the way, I tell people that I grew up in Taree, but actually the place I grew up in is called Chatham. So there you go, Wilf. You can try and thread that into your next lame joke. And I actually, and you'd be probably the only person in the room who'd be interested to know that Chatham is older than Taree. But there you go. And indeed, it is named after Captain James Cook. Yes, which because it was a boat building centre on the Manning River. There were six outfits building timber boats in the 1800s there to take the red cedar all around the world. Anyway, and I went to Chatham High School and Chatham Public School, and there you go. So we moved to a little timber house in, I think it was 1960, a little timber house, newly constructed. There was about 300 metres from the local public school. That's where that's 5 kids went to school at that public school. And then as I was at the public school, fortunately, the high school was built even closer to home, 100 metres. So I literally went home for lunch, corned beef and pickles sandwiches for lunch, pretty much most days. So, but because the dairy farm had gone broke, my father had to find something else to do to provide a sufficient income, and he never quite achieved this, a sufficient income for his wife and, it's turned out, 5 children. And he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was the job he did when he left school at age 13, to join his brothers cutting timber. And so he was a timber worker for the rest of his life. But we still had relatives on both sides of the family. He'd come off a dairy farm, my mother had come off a dairy farm. Most of their relatives were engaged in dairy farming or beef cattle farming, and so I had a lot of exposure to the local farming community as I was growing up, and of course also to the timber industry. And as a young bloke, I was trying to figure out why any of this made any sense, because to a young bloke it didn't look like it did. And then I went off to university curious about, wanting to understand why this all made sense, because surely it did. Surely it made sense. And then I discovered through study and then further engagement with people that, including back in the place where I grew up, that really a lot of it didn't make sense, and some of it does. And I think the quest has been, at least for me, has been to figure out which bits make sense, which bits don't, and how we make everything make sense. That's really been the quest. That is, I started off, another way of saying it is that my interest in the condition of the natural environment predates by at least 18 years my interest in economics.
More specifically then, Ken, moving into, since 2002, the Wentworth group of concerned scientists' first blueprint through the Millennium Drought, then the subsequent 15 years of drought-breaking rains, bushfires, droughts again. A lot's happened in that 25 years, leading up to my next question, which will be about the blueprint that's just been launched.
Yeah.
Could you set the scene a little over that period of time about the need, the drivers for...
Yeah, sure. Or maybe I should go a little further back. When I started studying economics, I studied a form of economics, neoclassical economics, that is literally divorced from reality. I mean, literally it is, right? If you go back, and I'm a little bit of an economic historian, and if you go back further into the origins of economics as a discipline, you'll find that land features very, very strongly in economic models. And in fact, it was the focus of some of the early economists, and Adam Smith certainly spent a bit of time talking about the land. By the late 1800s, maybe even the middle 1800s, you won't find land mentioned in economic theory much at all, until recently, right? And, Marxian economics, land, no, it's all about the contest between labour and capital. Neoclassical economics, which is what I learned at university, and Keynesian economics, which I also learned at university. Land, a factor of production, what are you talking about? No, we can ignore land. Not only land, but we can ignore any dependence of the economic growth machine upon services or materials that are sourced from what these days most people in the room would call a stock of natural capital. We can just ignore it. And, when economists, neoclassical economists, became challenged by, outfits like the Club of Rome in their Limits to Growth publication in the early 1970s, when they were questioned whether their exponential growth models could possibly be sustainable when there's no accounting of the reliance that the industrial machine necessarily places, or at the time anyway, necessarily placed on fossil fuels and iron ore and, all of those material inputs or raw materials that go into industry, the economists quickly found satisfied themselves at least that a sufficiently high rate of technological progress would allow us to continue to ignore that fundamental dependence of the economic system upon the natural system. And then, of course, along came the first and second oil price shocks, and even economists had to start to worry about those things, but they quickly calculated, and I remember actually there was a brilliant paper written by Joe Stiglitz, a name that would be familiar to just about everybody in this audience here, and I don't know how Joe feels about this paper these days, but anyway, as a brash young neoclassical economist, he demonstrated that you didn't need a very high rate of technological progress at all to be able to ignore the economy's dependence upon fossil fuels. And even back then, I think about it, even back then, there were people who were starting to worry about the greenhouse effect, starting to worry about climate change. And there were people even back then, even in the 1970s, of course, and they weren't all folk singers, but you know some of the songs I'm talking about, who started worrying about the impact on humans of continued destruction of the natural environment, even back then. And this goes way beyond worrying about the dependence of the industrial machine upon continuous supplies or limitless supplies of fossil fuels and of iron ore and so on. It's quite a different concern that's being expressed here. That big feedback loop between industrial activity and the condition of the natural systems, and then how a deteriorating condition in natural systems described by their ecology, by their biology, by their physics, by their chemistry, how that deterioration might actually have some impact on the industrial machine, might actually cause us to pause and ask the question, whether we shouldn't think in a rather more sophisticated fashion about the dependence of economic activity upon the condition of the natural environment. And before answering your question, because I know I still haven't answered it, let me say one last thing that's relevant to this. The great neoclassical economist who's credited with the development of the neoclassical growth model, which anybody who studies economics beyond third year gets to learn about, a fellow by the name of Robert Solow, who of course won the Nobel Prize for his contributions. It wasn't until, and that was 1956 that he wrote the paper, it wasn't until 2009 that he conceded that there was something here to be examined, that maybe we economists should have spent more time thinking rather more deeply about the dependence of the economic system upon the natural world. From 1956 to 2009, he maintained the opposite, right? How about that? But anyway, 2009. 2002, when that fabulous Wentworth Group piece of work was done, and I think one of the motivators for it, because I was obviously in the Treasury, and so I had no business being a Wentworth Group scientist, and I wasn't, but I was certainly open to the conversation. And the motivator for it, at least in my mind, was how do we explain to people that this shaping of the problem as being an inevitable contest between the environment and development, how do we explain to people that that's just bullshit, right? That was the challenge, and I think it did a pretty good job, and I think like a very good job actually, and I think that it has influenced a lot of people's thinking subsequently. I think too that the consequences of global warming, the increasing severity and intensity of bushfires, of floods, of wild storms, the struggle that people all over the country these days are finding to get insurance to cover their precious assets, their businesses, their houses, their livelihoods. This has brought home to people that, oh hell, maybe there is something here, and that we do have to change the way that we do things. So I think that has helped as well. And I think we're now at a really interesting juncture where there's broad acceptance of the need to think about these things in a more sophisticated, more holistic fashion. And to instead of environmentalists seeing, let me call them that for the moment, I actually think we're all environmentalists of one form or another, but instead of environmentalists seeing market mechanisms as the enemy, and instead of business people seeing environmentalists as the enemy, that we recognise that there is something here that allows both to help the other. And so I have, particularly since leaving the Treasury, I've found myself involved in more and more organisations and more projects that are asking the question, how can market structures and market instruments, market incentives, smart regulation, not dumb stuff, how can that help produce better environmental outcomes? And maybe that can be done in a way that provides benefits generally. Right, so provides benefits. I am talking about financial benefits here as well, and not just environmental benefits. But how can that be done in a way that provides financial benefits to the people who are, at least for their lifetimes, custodians of the natural world?
Moving then to 24 years later, another blueprint from the Wentworth Group.
Yeah.
Which has been released with a focus on New South Wales and empowerment for regional communities and landowners, which you've just described.
Yeah.
And a range of recommendations in that report. At a pretty important juncture, as you say, there's commitments made by the New South Wales government to reforms of local land services and veg clearing. What are the next steps from this blueprint being announced? Where do we see it going?
I'm pretty optimistic, really. And by the way, one of the reasons for and I see your head nodding, and I'm very pleased to see your head nodding, because what I wanted to say is that I think one of the things that distinguishes New South Wales from much of the rest of the country is that there is bipartisan recognition of the importance of the natural world. So I'm actually quite optimistic. I mean, a lot of people who are convinced that our political system, our democratic political system is broken. I don't believe it's broken in New South Wales. I do not. And one of the reasons I don't is because people I talk to in the New South Wales Parliament, I don't see denial about the importance of the condition of natural capital. I do see differences, of course, on some things, but I got to say, on that matter, I don't. And have had, conversations with ministers from successive governments in New South Wales, where the conversations all have been about how can you help us find ways of restoring natural capital in the state of New South Wales. Anyway, so that's the first point. Secondly, though, to get to what it involves, on one radio interview this morning, today's become a bit of a blur, to be honest, but although not right now, Wilf. But no, I feel quite grounded here, mate. But one of the interviews I did, I said, imagine that Australia. Imagine, if you can, that this continent had not, as of today, experienced European settlement. So it was kind of in some pristine natural state, let's suppose. But everything else that's happened in the world has happened, and then the Europeans come to the shores of this country today. And given what they know about everything else that's happened to biophysical systems around the world, including, of course, climate change, and if they thought they were going to have 3 levels of government, if they realised that that's what they were going to do, where would they start, right? Where would they start? And I reckon the first thing they would do is they would conclude, they'd come very quickly to the view that without a decent regional planning process, nothing was going to make any sense, right? And so they would develop a mechanism that bound in all 3 levels of government, plus local community organisations, plus First Nations people, to talk about how we as a group, collectively, secure in a particular place, let's say a bioregion, how we secure economic and social development whilst at the same time ensuring that 200 or 300 years down the track, we still have a magnificent natural environment, because you see, those people, because they're landing on our shores, on the shores of this continent today, they understand the importance of a properly functioning natural environment. That's what they do. I reckon that is the first thing. How you do it, that's still to be figured out, although we're running out of time to figure this one out. And I do think that governments understand it. When I was leading the review a few years ago of the Biodiversity Conservation Act in New South Wales, we identified regional planning. We weren't sure whether it should be bioregional, but anyway, that's a sidebar comment. But anyway, regional planning as being absolutely fundamental, right? And by the way, the Commonwealth government had already, maybe not, no, I'm overstating, a couple of ministers in the Commonwealth government were already aware that regional plans were going to have to focus strongly. And in my in the place where I live, because I live back up where I grew up, I moved back up there about 10 years ago into the Manning Valley, and was engaging with local government people up there, and they certainly were emphasising the importance of regional planning approaches, right? So they got it. This is not it's not a new concept. It may still be, for many people, a strange concept, but it's not a new concept. I don't see how, as a country, we are going to achieve the federal government, the Australian government's carbon abatement targets, not 2035 and certainly not net zero by 2050, without a process that allows those who have an interest in the condition, the economic, social and environmental condition of their local communities, a participatory role. I just don't see how the hell it's going to happen. And, you know, in discussions that I've been party to, chaired a few of them over recent years with the big renewable energy providers, the big wind projects, the big solar projects, those who are responsible for transmission lines and so on, they all agree. They don't disagree with this. They say we do need this because we're at risk of losing social licence. So how the hell the government achieves its net zero ambition without something like this, I do not know. But then also, I do not know how the housing minister or housing ministers, federal and state, achieve their ambitions without something like this. And I do not know how we will ever secure more finance for the landholders, the farmers, the custodians of this land, to be able to restore nature at landscape scale, to be able to protect us, make us more resilient as human inhabitants on this continent, more resilient against future catastrophic events. I don't think there is any alternative. I think that regional planning has to be at the base of it. And having said that, I am very conscious that neoclassical economists think economic planning is bullshit. But the way I rationalise these two things is this. Neoclassical economists do accept that intelligent recognition and specification of constraints is fundamental, absolutely fundamental. And that all of our wonderful mathematical techniques that we have to optimise this and that, with all of our calculus and our calculus of variations and all that kind of stuff that I studied at university, if you don't get an accurate specification of the constraints against which you're optimising, your results are just rubbish. They're rubbish. Forget it. And that's what economics has been lacking, is a recognition of those constraints and a sophisticated articulation of what those constraints are. But I think we're now at the point where most people in the economics profession understand that, and I think maybe they don't know how to engage yet, but a lot do want to engage with both landholders and with scientists and with community groups and with governments to try to solve this.
Thanks, Ken. Well, recognising our constraints, we do have limited time now for customer. I'm becoming an economist already. Audience questions for you. Don't worry, it's a blur for me today as well. So, Ben, if I hand the mic over to you, please. Questions?
Dr. Henry, Nick Savage from New South Wales Farmers. You mentioned your participation in the review of the Biodiversity Conservation Act and not having a contest between environment and farmers. One of the recommendations was the primacy of the BC Act over all other legislation.
Yeah.
Interested to know your thoughts on how that would work practically in New South Wales. Bit of a follow-on from that one, I guess, in relation to the Land Management Code and the LLS Act. Yeah. So I still think that should be the case. And the reason I think it should be the case is that, but I don't mean that the Biodiversity Conservation Act should direct everything that happens on land. It should not. What it should do is to protect the stuff that absolutely needs to be protected. That's the stuff that should have primacy. I still think that has to happen, otherwise the rest doesn't make any sense. If we are not capable of, as a community, if we're not capable of identifying no-go zones, like for land clearing, for example, for any purpose, I don't care what the purpose is, well, I do care, but I don't think it should matter for the identification of no-go zones. If we're not capable of doing that, then we have a system that lacks integrity.
and this does matter, because if you've got a system that professes, maintains that it really is protecting critical habitat for endangered species, that it really is protecting critical ecosystems and ensuring that those things are there for the benefit not only of this generation but of future generations and so on. If that is your claim, and yet you publish, as we do these days, as the New South Wales government does these days, on a regular basis but with a few years lag, data showing that the rate of land clearing is accelerating, not falling, data showing that of 12 threatened native species, between 5 and 15% of their remaining habitat has been wiped out, that over a 5-year period, that in the same period of time, a bit more than 33,000 hectares of riparian vegetation has been bulldozed. If that's what your data's showing, then the whole system lacks integrity. And if the system lacks integrity, at some stage, there's going to be a heavy pendulum swing that will take us to a place that I don't think anybody in this room wants to go to. So I think we do have to find a way of assuring the community at large that the stuff that absolutely needs to be protected is indeed being protected, and that for the rest we allow the experts, i.e. the owners, the landholders anyway, the farmers, to do what they do best. That's what I think we've got to do. We're close to that. And I think we are going to achieve that. I'm very optimistic that we will achieve that. And actually one reason I'm optimistic, and maybe I don't want to sound like a radical here, but I think governments and farmers and foresters for that matter know that technology is going to do it anyway. There are organisations out there that could fairly cheaply undertake this monitoring, and I'm not just talking about Google Earth, but they could do it, and they may indeed want to do it. And so I think it's coming anyway, but it would be much better if this real-time spatial data was available to everybody in the community through a process that came out of cooperative discussion between the 3 levels of government and the local communities, most importantly the landholders, and that everybody agreed that, okay, these are the rules and this is all now going to be nice, open and transparent and so on. And the Wentworth Group report, and I'm not speaking for it, I'm speaking about it, but the way I read it, it's on a similar track. That's what it's saying. We need more transparency. It's got to be high quality data and it's got to be readily accessible.
Dr. Henry Robert Hardy from NBN and the Farm Riders, the other president of Vice, alongside Wilf. In your last answer, you referenced the volume of land which has been cleared.
Yeah.
And some would argue that that is a cheap headline because it fails to appreciate what is actually being cleared and whether it's leading to enhanced biodiversity outcomes. And in previous slides and previous roles, I've seen evidence to suggest that clearing a land of woody weeds improves the biodiversity outcome because it reintroduces otherwise extinct native species to that landscape.
Yeah.
How do we better target the conversation you're having around better land management to ensure that it's a conversation about quality, not quantity, and we're not scaring people into thinking that vast swathes of the environment are being bulldozed with D9s, when in some instances it may lead to improved environmental outcomes. Not all, but in some.
Yeah.
So it's a quantitative argument.
Yeah, see, I don't disagree with you, but I think it's your problem, right? I mean, if you are defending land clearing, I don't know whether you're defending land clearing with that argument or not, but if you are defending land clearing with that argument, it's your problem. Because the problem is you have no hard evidence to support the proposition that the land clearing that's occurring is actually beneficial for the environment. That's the problem. I think that, I mean, when we did the review of the Biodiversity Conservation Act, and although we were not charged with reviewing the arrangements that cover land clearing, I nevertheless requested data on land clearing, and I was shocked and appalled to see that most of the land clearing that had occurred in New South Wales in the 5 years, in the most recent 5-year period, was, quotes, unallocated. And I said, you've got to be kidding. We had a regime change in 2016, this was designed, this regime change designed to assure everybody in the community that things were going to get better, not worse. It was designed to reduce contest. 2016 was pretty ugly debates, and this was designed to take the heat out of the debates. And you're telling me 5 years later that most of the land cleared, you have no idea where it was cleared, who cleared it, why it was cleared? Really? Is this how you take the temperature out of this debate? I don't think so. I really think that, and I don't think we're disagreeing here, I think that we need the data so that we know, so that there is no argument, right? And this is not beyond our competence to be able to do this. And as I said, if government doesn't do it, somebody else is going to do it. So I think we should get on with it and do it. And I hope you're right. I hope you're right. But at the moment, I wouldn't be able to convince myself on the basis of the data that's presently available. I couldn't.
Ken, Peter Cochrane, Assistant Commissioner with the New South Wales Natural Resources Commission. You alluded to the challenges, hopefully opportunities, of our multiple levels of government. And given your experience and the urgency of the matters that we're talking about, the coordination and complementarity between levels of government is never more important. And so the Commonwealth, in some respects, is discovering and rediscovering regional planning, nature repair market, etc. But they've got to work together. What's the magic sauce there? Money.
I mean, it is as simple as that. But I'll give you an illustration, right? So some years ago, the foundation that I chair, the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation, we started talking about the New South Wales and the Queensland government about a means of getting money from the Commonwealth government in order to protect what's left of the biodiversity in state forests, and also large tracts of land that are subject to land clearing. And we got traction, we got an audience with both governments, and at the time they were, there's been a change of government in both states in the interim, but we got traction in talking to both governments because we were able to say to them, we reckon we could develop or have people develop an Australian carbon credit unit method for both improved native forest management and for avoided regrowth clearing. We reckon we could. We spent the money, our foundation did, having these methods developed. These methods were then, one of them proposed by, one was proposed by the New South Wales government to ERAC. The other was proposed by the Queensland government to ERAC. There's been a change of government in Queensland. They're still the proponent of that carbon method. Both those methods are presently before ERAC. They're number 1 and 2 in their list of carbon methods that they are evaluating. We will know shortly what the outcome of that evaluation process is. That's an example. And of course, the Commonwealth government has been fully aware of this all the way through, right? And this is a way of identifying things that matter to one level of government and figuring out how they might also be made to matter to another level of government. We didn't have to get the ministers to sit in a room together and bash something out. It was kind of, that's what you want and that's what you want, and maybe we can use market mechanisms, because that's what it is, market mechanisms, in order to achieve an outcome that benefits both. So that's an example. I think there is enormous opportunity, even if we just confine ourselves for the moment to thinking about how you put the climate change goals, which are a current federal government priority, how you put those together with landscape restoration. There's enormous opportunity. my local council, some people from the local council opened a conversation with me some years ago up where I live and said, blue carbon. We've been thinking about what this could do to the acid sulphate soils along the Menning River. You know, there have been acid sulphate soils since the early 1900s. Once the red cedar had been stripped out, guess what happened? Everybody thought it would be good for dairy cattle and corn, and it was for a few years, yeah, but only a few years. So I think there's enormous opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. My name is Jackie Munro. I'm the New South Wales Shadow Environment Minister. Really appreciated the conversation, particularly around land clearing. I also was curious about how we can protect areas of land that are, have biodiversity value and conservation value, but are held by multiple landowners in a particular area, and if you had done any work on that issue.
Whoa, nothing's coming. No, it's a great question. Nothing's coming to mind. I mean, well, one thing. No, there is some. I mean, one of the issues confronting relatively small, or anyway not large, landholders right across Australia is how they get access to the carbon market, for example, right? And of course, the carbon aggregators, and I'm friends with all of them, I think. Anyway, I want to be seen to be a friend with all of them. Of course, they will say, well, we'll play the role of the intermediary. That's their business model, right? Not necessarily to aggregate several farms together, but maybe. There are some who, and I'm not going to say too much about this, but there are some who have spoken to me recently who see themselves as disintermediators. They'd like to disrupt the model. They would like to, through a mutual of landholders, do it collectively and not rely upon the carbon aggregators. There's a lot of interest in that, more in Queensland, I think, than in New South Wales, but nevertheless, there is quite a lot of interest in it. And I think Ben, we were having this conversation earlier, weren't we, about we've lost something in the disappearance of the mutuals, I think. We have, and not just in this area, but, you know, in insurance as well. Maybe. And I just wonder, I mean, I don't know, but I'd be pleased to see something evolve of that sort, yeah.
Thank you, Ken. I'm sorry that we don't have more time for more questions, but we'll certainly make time now for catching up afterwards. Last time Ken and I caught up, towards the end of a bottle of Shiraz, I did confide in him that he reminded me of my father in his, not only his appearance, but his tone of voice. But now that he's chipping me on my humour, you can see it's a real father-son relationship. So with that, thanks, Dad. Thanks, Ken. If you could please join me in thanking Ken.